This is the slideshow for key issue 2 of chapter 4 on folk and popular culture, of course, in our unit 3 on culture. We're going to be talking about material culture, and this includes clothing, it includes food, shelter, any other thing that human beings create that can reflect their culture. Let's talk about how it's diffused. Folk material culture diffuses slowly through the process of migration, and that would be relocation diffusion. Popular material culture diffuses rapidly. Access is determined by having sufficient income to embrace it. So again, like we talked about in the last lecture, with popular culture, it's really not physical barriers that prevent people from accessing it. It's usually monetary barriers. Folk clothing preferences. The style of clothing worn in response to distinctive agricultural practices and climatic conditions. This is not always true, but most elements of physical culture you can at some point connect back to the environment. For example, it is a folk custom in the Netherlands and other parts of Northern Europe as well, but especially the Netherlands, to wear wooden shoes because of practical use in wet climates. These are often known as clogs, and you can find them in a lot of different cultures from Northern Europe, to Southeastern Asia and many places in between. And it has to do with the environment, but also the kind of practice that is used. Like I said, in Southeast Asia, someone might wear wooden shoes because they're working in a rice paddy. Also, fur-lined boots protect against cold in Arctic climates. These are just little examples of people's clothing being a product of their environment. You're not going to see this very often anymore, but as you can see here, someone older may still embrace that tradition. This is a picture from Stellendam, Netherlands. And we also talked about cold weather climates. As you can see on the bottom left there, you have a Inuit person and his furry boots, and indeed furry everything, protects them against the frigid cold. We take it a little bit far in the United States sometimes, as you can see in that little clip from A Christmas Story. Hope you get to watch that movie this season. And I just wanted to throw in a popular culture connection here. So much of popular culture comes from folk culture. As you can see, Ugg boots in the bottom right-hand corner. I've seen Ugg boots worn with shorts. So it's not necessarily to keep you warm. It's something that started that way and then adapted into style. And if we're talking about cold weather, we should also talk about warm weather. On the left here, you have traditional sari, which is one of the, not the only, but one of the traditional styles of dress for women in South Asia. And there are many different styles. You have some that are more conservative than this one and some that are less. But if we're talking about the environment, the extreme heat that is reached in places like India is a factor in the style of dress that people are wearing. Something like this that's long and flowing can protect you from the sun, but also allow ventilation and allow airflow. And then on the right, this is a picture of a guy named T.E. Lawrence. You may hear about in your history class. He was in the British military and during the time of the British Empire, and was tasked with helping the Saudi people overthrow the Turks in Saudi Arabia. And as you can see, he adopted their style of dress, not just to be like him, to be like them, which was an important part of gaining their trust, But because in the desert the sun is pounding down on you, and why it might seem tempting to run around in shorts and a t-shirt, it's actually a bad idea because you have no protection from the sun. And so, again, flowing clothing like this that actually covers you to protect you from getting sunburnt is very important. Here's a little map showing women's dress codes across mostly the Muslim world. In blue, and you don't see very much of that, there's no pressure to veil or not wear a veil. In this dark green, modesty is the custom, but most women do not wear veils. You see that throughout a couple parts of Northern Africa, mostly northeastern Europe. In green, the dress code may be required, but veiling is uncommon. And then in this, I think that's brown, dress code's required and veiling is common. And then you get the darker brown, dress code is enforced with violence or legal prosecution. So it's either a part of the law in these places, or it is just strictly enforced by the society itself. And I will note, everything seems to be in one region, except you do have Indonesia here, which is the most populous Muslim nation in the world. It is this is a good opportunity for me to note that understanding history can be helpful in understanding geography. The uh, veils that we associate with Islam are certainly a big part of that culture, but they were also a part of Christianity when the center of Christianity was in Constantinople in what is now Turkey. And so we really see this as a regional practice that has spread through the religion of Islam and has been mostly lost to Christians, though in parts of Africa, especially in East Africa, you do have Christian women who also wear something similar to hijab, who wear a veil. Let's talk about popular clothing. The style of clothing generally reflects occupation in a country that is affected by popular culture and income as well, rather than particular environment. So examples of this include business suits worn by professionals and designer clothes worn by the affluent. So again, often has to do with what your job is more than where you live. Someone might be living in the South, like Matlock here. Your parents would probably get that reference. Or maybe you would if you watch TV with your grandparents. But this is a Southern lawyer, and he's down in the South where it's real hot. He still wears a suit. He's not running around with shorts and a t-shirt, even though it'd probably feel better. And then it's just another example, as is the image on the left, of people wearing clothes that are appropriate to their occupation. I just think this is kind of funny. The construction dude eating at a fast food restaurant on the weekend, starter pack. You've got the old guy's rule shirt and the long jorts, very important. Not always accurate. And of course, we have high fashion, and this is a big part of popular culture that we have fashion designers always trying to come up with some new design. I don't think that what's her name's meat dress ever caught on, and hopefully this thing on the right is not going to catch on. But as ridiculous as it may seem, these fashion trends, some of them do end up, though they may evolve and get a little bit tamer, they do end up a part of our culture. And the fashion that gets unveiled in Paris might end up influencing the clothes that you buy at Target after just a few months. We talked about how communications is a really big part of popular culture. Improved communications is central to rapid diffusion. For example, the time for original designs for women's dresses to be designed in fashion capitals like Paris or London or New York, and then reproductions being available in stores, it used to be years. It used to take years from those styles to move from the runway to the rack. But now it takes as few as a number of weeks. Jeans is an important symbol of the diffusion of Western popular culture. If you go back to the time of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, jeans were actually seen as a way of protesting communism. And people would smuggle jeans into Russia, into the Soviet Union, and kind of wear them as a protest because jeans were seen as a symbol of Western culture and a symbol of America. But it's important to note that even if countries adopt Western culture or adopt American popular culture, as is the case of blue jeans, they often put their own spin on it. And so we see this as an example of local diversity. In Japan, people might customize jeans with patches and cutouts. In Korea, jeans are often frayed, ripped, or shredded, which again happens here, certainly. In Italy, jeans are bleached out. So, some great examples of jeans here. You get your mom jeans, which I think have gone out of style a little bit. And President Obama was often made fun of for his dad jeans. I think they're pretty good jeans. I approve of dad jeans. People adapt their food preferences to conditions in their environment. Again, not always, but when we look back at food history, we have to acknowledge that the environment plays the largest role in what people eat. In Asia, in the southern regions, which are milder and have moister climates, warmer climates that get more rain, rice is prevalent in dishes. But in drier regions such as the north or west, wheat makes a bigger part of the diet. In Europe, we have a couple of examples. Italy, the preference for quick frying foods, so sauteing things or boiling noodles, really resulted from fuel shortages. But in Northern Europe, where there are great forests, abundant wood supply encouraged slow stewing and roasting of foods. It's just interesting to think about how different styles of cooking developed because of the resources that were available. Of course, Italy being surrounded by the Mediterranean and existing in that climate, there's not a lot of forest, not a lot of wood to be used, at least not to be burned. Here's a map showing average production in tons of wine. And so you can see the areas that produce the most wine. Notice the Middle East and North Africa, aside from a couple of countries, it's not very prevalent. And that is because Islam generally prohibits the consumption of alcohol. The United States produces a lot of wine, mostly in California. South American countries like Chile and Argentina produce a lot of wine because of their climate. And the most famous wine producing region of the world is, of course, the Mediterranean, places like France and Italy. But Australia has been producing a lot of wine. You don't think of China when you think about wine production, really, or Russia. But if you think about the number of people in China, it makes sense that so much rice wine would be produced. Let's talk about food taboos. Many folk customs attribute a signature or distinctive characteristic to everything in nature. and things that are meant to be avoided are taboos, whether those are practices or, in this case, foods. People may desire or avoid certain foods as a result of perceived beneficial or harmful natural traits. A restriction imposed by social custom to eat particular plants or animals that are believed to embody negative forces is a taboo. Ancient Hebrews in the Bible were forbidden to eat animals that did not chew their cud or that have cloven feet, or fish lacking fins or scales. This means no shellfish, and it means no pork, just like Muslims. Again, you see a cultural connection there between Jews and Muslims being from the same region and having some of the same core beliefs, even if they are seen as opposite ends of the religious spectrum. They're really quite close, at least in this regard. We'll talk more about that when we get to religion. Hindus embraced a taboo against consuming cattle. So we're going to look at some reasons for this. For the Hebrews, the pig is more suited for sedentary farming, not pastoral nomadism. And the Hebrews moved around for centuries. For Muslims, the pigs are unsuited for the dry lands of the Arabian Peninsula. They would compete with humans for food and water and not be a beast of burden, meaning they can't carry stuff. They're not really good for anything except being eaten, and they consume so much food that it doesn't make sense to have them. Now, this is a possible explanation for why these were banned, but it does limit the influence of just religion and religious teaching on the people, so you can take it with a grain of salt. Again, using the same logic, the high number of oxen needed for agriculture in India may have contributed to this idea that consuming cows is forbidden. Environmental concerns account for only part of the reason for taboos, right? So it is important to note that religion has its very strong place in people's lives and what they do. Look at a couple interesting cross-cultural food taboos next. I love cheese. Likely you love cheese, but a large percentage of the world's human population can't stand cheese. And I really mean that literally. Many people in China, especially Han Chinese, their palate has not been adapted to be able to handle dairy products. Most people would have been lactose intolerant naturally had their ancestors not begun to eat dairy foods like most Europeans did, like my European ancestors did. And so we have a real cultural difference here, and where many Asians think that cheese is gross because it's actually rotting milk or rotten milk, but many Europeans or Westerners would try something like this fruit here, durian, and if you've ever tried it, you know it kind of smells like rotting flesh. It's pretty disgusting by most standards, and a sign from, I believe this is from Thailand, it might be from Singapore, as you see here on the bottom left, actually bans durians because they can be so offensive to people's palates and people's noses. Let's look at some elements of popular culture, food culture, and look at the differences between and among countries. We can note that cola preferences can actually be influenced by politics. This is kind of interesting. Toward the end of the Soviet Union, the government there actually allowed Pepsi to be permitted for sale within the country. What you have to understand, if you don't already, is that the the Soviet Union and the United States were at odds in what was known as the Cold War. And it was really a war over, it wasn't a shooting war, but it was a long-term political disagreement between how government should be run. The United States was democratic, the Soviet Union was communist. And because they were anti-USA and we were anti-them, they did not let many American products into their country. But they started allowing Pepsi to be sold. Later on, when the Soviet Union collapsed and went back to being just Russia again, many former Soviets switched to Coke because they associated Pepsi with communism, which is something that I still associate Pepsi with because I prefer Coke. But cola preferences can also be influenced by religion. In Southwest Asia, predominantly Muslim countries have boycotted products sold in Israel because Israel is predominantly Jewish. Coke is an example of that. But also, a number of Muslim countries don't drink soda in general because soda is seen as a stimulant, which, depending on how conservative you are in Islam, that also is forbidden, along with coffee. The Church of Latter-day Saints has said for a long time that things like soda are not permissible to someone observing the Mormon religion, but they've recently relaxed on this, and you can see that in the relatively recent news that Brigham Young University has started allowing Coca-Cola. So they're going to have some pretty crazy college parties, everybody drinking soda. That's my prediction, at least. Again, we see this interesting story of Pepsi and Coke in the Soviet Union. And Pepsi was allowed in if they could change the name of it. So they changed the name from Pepsi to something Russian, put their Soviet spin on it, and did the same thing with, to a much lesser degree, with Coca-Cola. Notice Coca-Cola, which began kind of taking over Russia once communism fell, they didn't have to change their name, really, like Pepsi had to under the Soviet Union. There's former President Bill Clinton and First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton. Here we see cola preferences, Pepsi versus Coke. Notice the percent market share held by leading soft drinks. And we see that Coke is king in most parts of the world, but Pepsi has South Asia and Canada and the Middle East as well. Interesting. Coke is far superior. That's not a fact, but it almost is. Let's talk about regional differences within the United States. Americans may choose beverages or snacks based on what is produced, grown, or imported locally. But I will say this is less and less frequent, especially in a more developed country, because we have national brands and we have such a high level of development as to where products can be moved rather quickly from place to place to place. But as you will see in the next slide, there are still regional differences. Wine consumption relatively high in California, and that's because that's where most of it is grown or produced. The grapes are grown there. Cultural backgrounds affect the amount and types of alcohol and snack foods consumed. Relatively little alcohol is consumed in Utah because of the strong presence of the Church of Latter-day Saints that advocates against drinking alcohol. I was in Utah last year, and became aware of something interesting that they call the Zion curtain, which is if someone at a restaurant or bar orders a mixed drink, a cocktail, they have to make that out of sight. And the idea is that they don't want young minds seeing somebody mixing up alcohol and wanting that themselves. And also, beer has to be brewed specifically different for Utah because of the laws there to have less alcohol in it than the kind of beer that can be sold in other states. But there's high consumption of alcohol in Nevada, and that, of course, is because of Las Vegas, people going to resorts and not making the wisest choices, drinking lots of alcohol. People on vacation tend to do that. Texans may prefer tortilla chips in greater numbers than in other places because of a strong Hispanic American presence, right? So these are just some examples. You can probably think of some other ones. Let's go to the next slide. This just shows the preferences for different fast food companies. In-N-Out Burger is pretty big out west. Sadly, we don't have it. It's pretty good. If you've ever had it, you probably agree with me. Dunkin' Donuts is extremely popular in the Northeast, as you can see in the red states there. Up in Canada, there's something called Tim Hortons, which is very similar. I think Dunkin' Donuts is pretty terrible, and that's because their donuts are baked, and I'm pretty sure they're not even made on site. They're brought in frozen. But they do have good coffee, so there's something. Krispy Kreme is king in the South, as it should be, because, oh man, it's so good. White Castle, and I know, why are we comparing donuts with hamburger places? I don't really know. This is just the one that your book has highlighted. But it is interesting to see where White Castle is dominant in the kind of Midwest, I guess you could call it, of the country, as well as up in the Northeast a little bit. Excuse me, Northwest. Just thought I should probably put this here just to make you mad. Let's look at housing and specifically where you will find particular types of housing. Now, I will go ahead and warn you, this is probably among the least interesting things that we talk about in this class, but we got to get through it. Some of you might be really fascinated by it. So if you are, I certainly don't want to underplay it because you might really like it. One thing that is interesting is the environmental influence on folk housing. People make things out of what's available. So available resources will influence the building materials used, whether it's stone, grass, sod, maybe even animal skins. So I've been to parts of the country like in the Southwest and places like New Mexico where traditional architecture reflects the environment. Adobe houses are everywhere, and it's made out of a certain type of brick, basically mud houses. And that, of course, reflects what they have. They don't have a lot of trees, so they don't have a lot of lumber, so they can't make things out of wood. The two most common building materials are wood and brick in the United States. Climate and local topography influence the design of housing structures as well. So not just materials, but how it's designed. So someone you should know about, R.W. McColl, is famous for this comparison of houses in 4 Chinese villages. He noted that all use similar building materials, including adobe and timber from desert poplar trees. Distinct designs in each location attributed to local cultural preferences and local geography. So even though they're using the same materials, the designs are different, and that really comes down to local cultural differences, but also how the geography of the land was different locally. So here's two obviously very different environments. The first one is in Oman, and the second one is in Estonia. So here we see those four different housing types in those four communities of Western China. Houses have second floor open air patios in Kashgar. In Turpan, they have small open courtyards. In Yishuan are large private courtyards. And in Dunhuang, sloped roofs. So if you need to pause that just to look at those noted differences, follow those lines back to the region of China, and maybe even theorize about why these differences exist. You can pause and do that. A distinctive form of folk houses may derive from religious or other customary beliefs. So we have environmental influences, we have the materials that are used, but also religious or other customary beliefs can influence how houses are designed. There might be certain sacred features like walls or door orientation or corners. For example, houses in south central part of Java face south, the direction of the the South Sea goddess, who holds the key to earth, according to local tradition. The eastern wall of a house is sacred in Fiji. All directions except south have significance in folk houses in Madagascar. So it's going to be different for different cultures. You might take a second to think about if your house has any significant features that have to do with religion. What we see here is that houses of Lao people in northern Laos are affected by sacred space. The fronts of Lao houses, such as those in the village of Muangnan, Laos, face one another across a path, and the backs face each other at the rear. Their ridge poles, which are the center line of the roof, are set perpendicular to the path, but parallel to a stream, if one is nearby. There may be one, there may not be one. Inside adjacent houses, people sleep in the orientation shown, so neighbors are head-to-head or feet-to-feet. Houses of Wan and Shan peoples in northern Thailand are also seen. In the village of Banmai Sakud, Thailand, the houses are not set in a straight line because of a belief that evil spirits move in straight lines, so they want to confuse them. Ridgepoles parallel the path, and the heads of all sleeping persons point eastward. Let's talk about U.S. folk housing and the diffusion of certain housing styles from east to west in the United States. The style of pioneer homes reflected whatever upscale style was prevailing at the place on the East Coast from which they migrated. So people moved east to west. And with them, they took their housing styles. Geographer Fred Niffen identified three major hearths or nodes of folk house forms in the United States. So three places where these traditional housing styles diffused from. So I'm going to go over the three and show you a couple pictures. Middle Atlantic housing style. It's a principal house type known as the I house, with one room deep and at least 2 rooms wide. This is a pretty wide but not very deep house. The lower Chesapeake Tidewater, the principal house type is characterized by 1 story with a steep roof and chimneys at either end. And in New England, the principal house style was box-shaped with a central hall. So you'd walk in at the middle of the house, There'd be a central hall and then rooms on either side. All right, there's the Mid-Atlantic I House. Again, not very deep, although this one kind of creates an L, as you can see, but wide. The Lower Chesapeake Tidewater House. Notice the two chimneys on either end, and it's rather tall. And the New England style house with a central hall. Again, just riveting information. But this is interesting. If you look, you can see how people have migrated and taken with them those housing types. They originated in three main source areas and diffused westward along different paths. These paths coincided with predominant routes taken by migrants from East Coast towards the interior of the country. So looking at this, we can understand a little bit about migration patterns. So as people moved west, they weren't likely to move, say, from New England down to Mississippi. They were more likely to move a little bit south, but mostly just continue going west. But from the mid-Atlantic, many people did move southward. And the lower Chesapeake and Tidewater housing style didn't make it really past the Appalachian Mountains. Now let's look at U.S. popular housing. Since the mid-20th century, houses display popular culture rather than regional influences. And this, of course, is because since the mid-20th century, we have definitely been a more developed country, and we have put a bigger emphasis on practicality than tradition. Also on style and giving people what they particularly want rather than just following a tradition of place. Most people no longer build their own houses. Instead, these are mass-produced by construction companies. Houses show the influence of shapes, materials, detailing, and other features of architectural style in vogue at any one point in time, meaning the style that is in. The dominant type of house construction in the United States was minimal traditional during the late 1940s and early 1950s, which you can see on the left there, followed by ranch houses during the late 1950s and 1960s. There's some pretty cool ranch houses in East Memphis. You're going to find more minimal traditional houses further west in Memphis because, again, as the years went on, people moved further east in Shelby County. The split level was a popular variant of the ranch between the 1950s and 1970s. And you do see some of these moving on into Germantown. And the contemporary style was popular for architect-designed houses during the same period. So not all contemporary style houses look like that, but that's an example. And you will also find those in East Memphis. The shed style was widely built in the late 1960s. Neo-eclectic styles, beginning with the mansard, were in vogue during the late 1960s. And then Neo-Tudor was popular in the 1970s, and the Neo-French in the 1980s. The neo-colonial style has been widely built since the 1950s, but has never dominated popular architecture. So I know that's a lot of information. If you need to go back and hear it again, you can. The big thing that I want us to see here is how migration has affected this, but also to see how with popular culture, people are given more choices. And that's it. We are done. As always, write down any questions that you have and send them my way.